HOA painted my barn overnight, but they never checked where my land actually began. I stepped out that morning and saw my grandfather's barn, painted white overnight, with HOA approved written across it, like they owned the place. No warning, no call, just someone crossing a line they thought didn't matter. I didn't argue, didn't react, because I already knew something they didn't. And by the time the survey came out, everything they built was standing on the wrong ground. If you've ever dealt with something like this, stay with me. And if you respect doing things the right way, go ahead and subscribe. There's more stories like this coming. Caleb Turner stepped out onto his porch just as the first light broke over the ridge, the kind of pale, steady sunrise that had marked the beginning of every working day on that land for as long as he could remember. The air carried the faint scent of dry grass and old wood, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it always had. Quiet, grounded, predictable. Then he looked up and stopped. The barn stood where it always had, rising beyond the fence line in the same place his grandfather had set the first posts more than 60 years earlier. But the color was wrong, not faded, not weathered. Wrong. What had once been deep red, sun-worn and honest, was now a flat, blinding white that caught the early light like something unnatural. And across the side, painted in letters taller than a man, were 3 words that didn't belong on his land, didn't belong on anything his family had ever built. HOA approved. Caleb didn't move. The world around him kept going. A truck passed somewhere down the county road. A gate creaked in the distance. But on that porch, everything narrowed to that wall of paint, and the message stamped across it like a claim. No letter had come. No call. No notice tied to the fence or tucked into his mailbox. Nothing but the result. Someone had walked onto his land in the dark and decided they had the authority to change it. He stepped down from the porch slowly, boots hitting the packed dirt with a quiet, measured rhythm. Gravel shifted underfoot as he moved closer, not rushing, not hesitating. The closer he got, the clearer the brush strokes became, fresh, deliberate, layered thick enough to bury the old red beneath it. The words were clean, careful. Someone had taken their time. That told him more than anything else. This hadn't been anger. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been planned. He stopped a few feet from the wall and reached out, pressing his fingers lightly against the paint. It was dry, not hours old, long enough to set, not long enough to belong there. Caleb pulled his hand back and looked at the white on his fingertips for a moment, before brushing it off against his jeans. Behind him, a screen door creaked open. "Caleb, you seeing this?" Mark Ellison stood on the edge of the porch, one hand resting against the frame, his voice carrying that uncertain edge people goma when they weren't sure how bad something really was. He'd walked over from his place down the road, probably drawn by the same thing that had pulled Caleb's eyes out here in the first place. Caleb didn't turn right away. "I see it," he said finally. Mark stepped down off the porch and came closer, squinting at the lettering like maybe it would explain itself if he stared long enough. "They can't just—" He stopped, shaking his head. "They didn't even tell you?" "No. That's—" Mark let out a breath. "That's not right." Caleb said nothing, because right and wrong weren't the question. The question was who thought they had the right to do it, and he already had a pretty good idea. Diane Whitaker had been pushing at the edges of his property for months. Letters about his fence, his mailbox. The height of his grass measured, apparently, by someone standing just far enough away to pretend it mattered to them. Always written in that same tone. Official, certain, just vague enough to sound like authority, without ever quite proving it. He'd answered every one of them the same way. Calm, documented, Final. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't stepped into her office, hadn't given her anything she could turn into a confrontation. And that, more than anything, had bothered her. Mark stepped closer to the wall, running his hand along the paint without touching it. "You gonna call the sheriff?" Caleb looked at the words again. HOA approved. It wasn't just paint. It was a statement. A line drawn across his property by someone who believed the line was theirs to draw. "No," Caleb said. Mark frowned slightly. "You're not?" "Not yet." "Caleb, I said not yet." There was no edge in his voice, no anger, just certainty. That was what made Mark stop talking. Caleb took a step back from the barn and turned, walking slowly along the side of it. His eyes moved across the structure, not just the paint, but everything around it. The fence line, the ground, the small stretch of grass that separated his property from the road. Details. He'd learned a long time ago that the truth didn't live in the big moments. It lived in the small things people forgot to look at. When he reached the corner of the barn, he paused. There, tucked beneath the edge of the workshop eave, barely visible unless you knew where to look, sat a small, weatherproof camera. Fixed in place, angled just enough to cover the open space around the barn. It had been there for years. Most people didn't notice it. Caleb did. He stood there for a moment, eyes on the lens, and for the first time since he stepped out onto the porch, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not frustration, understanding. Whoever had come onto his land last night hadn't asked permission, hadn't left a note, hadn't thought anyone would see. That was their first mistake. Behind him, Mark shifted his weight. "You thinking something?" Caleb turned back toward the barn, toward the white paint and the message that didn't belong. "I am," he said. "What?" Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked back toward the porch, slow and steady, as if the sight behind him no longer demanded his attention. He stepped up, picked up the coffee mug he'd left sitting on the railing, and took a long drink, eyes still on the barn over the rim. Mark watched him, waiting for anger, for shouting, for something that matched what had been done. But it didn't come. Caleb set the mug down carefully, exactly where it had been before. Then he looked out across the land, his land, the fence lines, the road, the barn standing wrong in the middle of it all. And then, almost to himself, he said, "They think this is about paint." Mark frowned. "It's not?" Caleb shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "It's about where they think the line is." He turned toward the door. Mark followed him with his eyes. "So what are you going to do?" Caleb paused at the threshold, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Then he glanced back over his shoulder, not at the barn, but at the ground between it and the road. "I'm going to find out," he said, "where it actually is." And with that, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Out in the morning light, the white paint still gleamed, and the words stayed where they were, for now. Inside the house, Caleb Turner didn't look at the barn again. He moved straight to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down with the same measured pace he used for everything that mattered. The folder drawer to his left slid open with a soft wooden scrape. Inside sat a stack of documents, old deeds, survey copies, tax records, kept in order, not for display, but for moments exactly like this. He didn't touch them yet. Instead, he reached for his phone. The first call went out without hesitation. "Tom," Caleb said when the line picked up, "I need you to come out. Full boundary. Everything you've got." Tom Alvarez didn't waste time asking why. "You want current lines or historical?" "Both." There was a brief pause on the other end. The kind that came when someone understood this wasn't routine. "I'll bring the 1984 file," Tom said, "and the older markers if I can locate them." "Good." Caleb hung up before anything else needed saying. The second call came just as fast. "Daniel." Daniel Ross answered on the third ring, voice steady, already alert. "Something happened." "They came onto my property last night," Caleb said. "Painted the barn, wrote their name across it." Silence just for a second. "Do you have proof?" Daniel asked. Caleb's eyes shifted briefly toward the back of the house, toward the direction of the barn and the small camera tucked beneath the eave. "Yes." That was enough. "Then don't confront them," Daniel said. "Not yet. Document everything. I'll clear my afternoon." Caleb nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see it. "I'm not planning on confronting anyone." "I figured," Daniel replied quietly. "That's why this might actually work." The call ended. Caleb set the phone down, fingers resting against the table for a moment, before lifting again. The third call took longer to connect. "County Recorder's Office," a woman answered, voice tired but attentive. "I need certified copies," Caleb said. "Everything tied to my parcel and the subdivision next to it. Plat maps, boundary filings, especially anything older than 1990. There was the sound of paper shifting. "Do you have a reference year?" she asked. "Start with 1984. Another pause. "That's older than what most people ask for," she said. "I'm not most people." She let out a small breath, then, "All right. Give me a few hours to pull what I can. I'll come pick them up." Caleb ended the call and finally leaned back in his chair. 3 calls. No raised voice. No sheriff. No reaction. Outside, word had already started spreading. By mid-morning, there were more trucks along the fence line than usual. People didn't walk up to the barn anymore. They stood back, just far enough to look without feeling like they were part of it. Conversations stayed low, half-whispered, like something about the situation didn't sit right with them. Mark Ellison remained near the gate, shifting between watching the barn and glancing toward the house. He wasn't the only one waiting. They were all expecting something, an argument, a confrontation, something loud enough to match what had been done. Instead, the front door opened. Caleb stepped out again, hat in hand this time, boots hitting the porch with the same steady rhythm as before. He didn't look toward the crowd immediately, didn't acknowledge the attention. He walked past them, straight toward the barn. The murmurs followed him, low and uncertain. When he reached the wall, he didn't touch the paint this time. He just stood there, looking at it, taking it in like a measurement rather than an offense. Mark finally spoke up. "Caleb, you sure you don't want me to call someone?" Caleb shook his head once. "No. You've got people walking onto your land, in the middle of the night. I know exactly what I've got," Caleb said, still facing the barn. That stopped Mark. Caleb turned then, finally meeting his eyes. "And I know exactly what I don't have yet," he added. Mark frowned. "What's that?" "Everything." There was no anger in it, just clarity. Mark hesitated. "So you're just letting it sit?" "For now." Caleb stepped back from the barn, scanning the ground again, the space between the fence, the road, and the structure itself. His gaze lingered longer this time, tracing something only he seemed to be measuring. "You ever notice," Caleb said quietly, "how people stop checking things once they think they own them?" Mark followed his line of sight, but didn't answer. Caleb continued. "They stop looking at where the line actually is." The words hung there, heavier than they sounded. Mark shifted uneasily. "You think this is about the boundary?" Caleb didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned and started back toward the house. Behind him, The barn stood unchanged, white paint glaring under the sun, the message still sharp and deliberate. But the tension in the air had shifted. It wasn't about what had been done anymore. It was about what was coming next. As Caleb stepped inside, he moved with the same quiet certainty he'd had all morning. Not rushed, not reactive, prepared, because while everyone else was still looking at the paint, he was already looking at the ground beneath it. And somewhere along that ground, something wasn't where it was supposed to be. The question wasn't whether he'd respond. The question was how far the response would go. And by the time anyone else realized that, it would already be too late. Diane Whitaker stood in her kitchen, holding a printed photo of the barn in both hands, the paper still warm from the printer. The white paint reflected even in the image. The bold lettering stretched across the wood like a declaration. HOA approved. She studied it for a long moment, lips pressed thin, then set it down on the granite counter beside a stack of neatly organized documents. Bylaws, meeting notes, violation templates. Everything labeled, everything controlled. Susan Keller sat across from her at the island, coffee untouched, watching Diane with a kind of quiet approval. "It looks better," Susan said finally. "Cleaner." Diane didn't answer right away. She turned toward the window instead, looking out over the row of identical mailboxes lining the entrance road, each one spaced evenly, painted the same shade, facing the same direction. "That's not the point," Diane said. Susan frowned slightly. "Then what is?" "The point," Diane replied, "is that people stop testing boundaries once they understand they exist." She picked up the photo again and tapped it lightly against the counter. "Caleb Turner's been testing them since the day we formed this association." Susan leaned back. "He sends letters. He sends corrections," Diane said sharply, quoting documents like he's the only one who knows how to read them. "And now?" Susan asked. Diane's expression shifted, something satisfied settling into place. "Now he understands." Susan hesitated. "You think he'll push back?" Diane shook her head. "No." There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt. "People like him don't push," she continued. "They stall, they delay, they pretend the rules don't apply until they realize they do." She slid the photo across the counter toward Susan. "This," Diane said, "removes the question." Across the road, the barn still stood bright under the late morning sun, visible from the entrance like a fixed point in the landscape. It had always been there, but it had never fit, not in Diane's mind, not in the image she'd spent years building. Uniformity meant value. Value meant control. And control required consistency. Caleb Turner had never been consistent. He didn't attend meetings, didn't argue publicly, didn't give her anything she could address in front of the board or document in a formal response. He just sent papers, every time. Fence complaint, answered with a copy of his deed. Mailbox notice, returned with a citation of original property lines. Grass violation, dismissed with a photograph and a timestamp. It wasn't defiance. That would have been easier to deal with. It was precision. And precision, Diane had learned, was harder to control. That was why she'd stopped waiting. 2 nights earlier, she'd stood in the dark beside Susan and the maintenance worker, watching the white paint settle over the barn's red surface. The compressor had hummed steadily, each pass covering another section, erasing the old color like it had never mattered. "No one's going to challenge this," Susan had said quietly. Diane had nodded. "Not after it's done." Now, standing in her kitchen, she believed that even more. She reached for her phone and dialed without looking at the number. "Linda?" she said when the line connected. On the other end, Linda Brooks answered quickly. "I saw it this morning," People are talking. Of course they are, Diane replied. That's how things change. There was a pause. Caleb hasn't said anything. Diane allowed herself a small smile. Exactly. You don't think he's planning something? Diane's tone sharpened slightly. Planning what? Filing another letter? Quoting another statute? Linda didn't respond. Diane continued. He's had every opportunity to comply. He chose not to. This is the result. But what if he won't, Diane cut in. He can't. She moved toward the table and picked up a binder, flipping it open to a section marked Community Standards. There's nothing in writing that protects that barn the way it was, she said. Nothing enforceable. But what about his land? Linda asked. Diane paused, just for a fraction of a second. Then she closed the binder. His land ends where the community begins, she said. And that line has been clear since the subdivision was built. Linda didn't sound convinced. You're sure about that? Diane's voice cooled. I wouldn't have acted if I wasn't. Across town, in a small office above a hardware store, Daniel Ross leaned back in his chair, phone pressed to his ear as Caleb spoke. You're certain the camera caught everything? Daniel asked. Every second, Caleb said. No gaps? No. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then this isn't just a violation. It's a case. Caleb said nothing. Daniel continued. Trespass, property damage, potential liability for the association itself, depending on how it's structured. I'm not interested in rushing it, Caleb said. I figured, Daniel replied. But we need to move deliberately, not slowly. I've already started. Daniel paused. What have you done? Surveys coming in, Caleb said. Full boundary. Historical records included. That got Daniel's attention. Why? He asked. Caleb's answer came without hesitation. Because I don't think they know where their line actually is. Back in her kitchen, Diane ended the call with Linda and set her phone down, the quiet of the room settling around her again. For a moment, she just stood there, listening to the stillness. Then she walked to the window once more. From where she stood, she could just see the edge of the road leading toward Caleb's property. A few trucks were still parked along the side, neighbors lingering longer than they needed to. Watching. Waiting. Diane didn't see uncertainty in that. She saw confirmation. The system worked. People saw the result, and they adjusted. That was how order was maintained. She turned away from the window and reached for another document, already thinking ahead. Next steps, next properties, next corrections. The barn in her mind was already resolved, handled, finished. What she didn't see, what she hadn't thought to check, was the quiet shift happening beyond the paint. Not in the barn, not in the letters, but in the ground itself. Because while she believed she had drawn the line, Caleb Turner was already preparing to move it. And once that line moved, everything she thought she controlled would be standing on the wrong side of it. The footage began at 2:11 a.m. Caleb watched it alone at his kitchen table, the glow of the laptop casting a steady light across the scattered documents he hadn't yet touched. The screen showed the empty stretch of land beside the barn, still and quiet, just the faint movement of wind across the grass. At 2:13, headlights appeared, dimmed before they reached the fence. A pickup rolled into view, stopping short of the boundary. The engine cut. Doors opened one by one. Diane Whitaker stepped out first. Even in the grainy black and white, her posture was unmistakable. Upright, certain, moving like she belonged there. Susan Keller followed, carrying something in both hands. A third figure climbed down from the passenger side, dragging a hose connected to a compressor sprayer in the truck bed. They didn't hesitate. No pause at the fence. No attempt to check where they were stepping. Diane crossed first, lifting a section of the split rail just enough to pass through. The others followed without question. Trespass. Clear, direct, unambiguous. Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen. They moved quickly across the grass, heading straight for the barn like they'd planned the route ahead of time. The sprayer kicked on seconds later. A low vibration even the camera seemed to pick up faintly through the image. White paint began to spread across the red wood. Slow at first, then faster. Broad passes, deliberate coverage, no concern for detail beyond replacing one color with another. The barn disappeared under it piece by piece, history erased in overlapping strokes. Susan handled the hose. The worker adjusted pressure. Diane stood back at first, watching, supervising. Then, after several minutes, she stepped forward. Caleb paused the video. He didn't need to see the rest to know what came next, but he watched it anyway. Diane reached into the truck bed and pulled out a brush. She dipped it once into a container, turned back to the wall, and began writing. Each letter took time, care. This wasn't vandalism done in anger. It was a message. HOA approved. She stepped back when she finished, tilting her head slightly as if inspecting the alignment. Susan said something. Her mouth moved, though the camera carried no sound. Diane gave a small nod, satisfied. At 2:27 a.m., they packed up. No rush, no urgency. They walked back the same way they came, lifting the fence, crossing out, loading the equipment. The truck started again, lights still low, and rolled away without leaving anything behind except the paint. Caleb let the video run until the screen returned to empty darkness. Then he closed the laptop halfway, resting his hands on either side of it. The evidence was complete. Names, faces, actions, no interpretation required. The next morning, the same footage looked very different from the other side of the road. Mark Ellison stood with two other neighbors near the fence, arms crossed, staring at the barn. The shock from earlier had shifted into something else. Unease, maybe even discomfort. "It doesn't feel right," one of them said quietly. Mark nodded. "No, it doesn't." "You think she had permission?" Mark didn't answer, because deep down, everyone there already knew the answer. Across the road, the door to Diane Whitaker's SUV shut with a sharp click. She stepped out with purpose, sunglasses in place, phone in hand, already mid-conversation. "Yes, I've seen it," she was saying. "And no, there's nothing to address. The property is now in compliance." She ended the call before reaching the group. The neighbors shifted slightly as she approached, giving her space without meaning to. Diane stopped just short of the fence, looking past them at the barn. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, "It's cleaner," she said. Mark turned toward her. "Cleaner?" "Uniform," Diane clarified. "Consistent with community standards." Mark let out a short breath. "That's not your property." Diane didn't look at him. "It's within view of the community." "That doesn't make it yours." She turned then, slowly, fixing him with a look that carried more patience than warmth. "It makes it relevant," she said. One of the other neighbors spoke up, quieter. "You didn't notify him." Diane's expression didn't change. "He's been notified multiple times regarding compliance issues." "Not about this," Mark said. Diane tilted her head slightly. "He had every opportunity to resolve the situation himself." "And because he didn't," Mark pressed, "you just walked onto his land?" Diane didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked back at the barn again, at the words painted across it. Then she said, "Sometimes action is required when communication fails." The group fell quiet. Because what she'd said wasn't an explanation. It was a justification. And everyone standing there understood the difference. Across the road, Caleb stepped out onto his porch again. This time, he didn't go to the barn. He didn't join the conversation. He just stood there, watching. Diane noticed him almost immediately. Their eyes met across the distance. She held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a finished transaction. Something done. Something settled. Caleb didn't nod back. He didn't react at all. After a few seconds, he turned and went back inside. The door closed quietly behind him. Back at the kitchen table, the laptop sat where he'd left it. The footage still fresh. The evidence complete. He opened the folder drawer again, this time pulling out a clean file. Inside, he placed a copy of the footage, photographs from the barn, a written timeline, exact times, exact actions, no interpretation. Then he added something new, a blank section at the back, for what came next. His phone buzzed. A message from Tom Alvarez. "On my way. Bringing original markers." Caleb looked at it for a moment, then set the phone down. Outside, Diane Whitaker turned away from the fence, satisfied the situation had been handled. The neighbors slowly dispersed, conversations low, uncertain. The barn stood where it always had, but the ground beneath it, that was about to be questioned for the first time in years. And once it was, nothing Diane had built her authority on would hold the same way again. Because paint could cover wood, but it couldn't rewrite the land. And Caleb Turner now had everything he needed to prove it. Tom Alvarez's truck rolled in just after noon, tires crunching slow across the gravel like he had nowhere else to be. He stepped out with a case in one hand and a rolled set of maps under the other, eyes already scanning the barn before Caleb even said a word. Tom didn't comment on the paint. He didn't need to. "You weren't kidding," he said, nodding once. "No," Caleb replied. Tom set the case down near the fence line and pulled out a tablet, bringing up a grid of coordinates overlaid on satellite imagery. "Walk me through what you think is wrong." Caleb didn't point at the barn. He pointed at the ground. "Start there," he said, indicating the strip between the barn and the road. "Then follow it out to the entrance." Tom studied the screen, then the land, then back again. "You think the subdivision's off?" "I think they stopped checking," Caleb said. Tom gave a short, almost amused exhale. Wouldn't be the first time. He powered on his equipment and began setting up, placing the tripod with practiced precision, aligning the instrument with a line only he could see. From the road, a few neighbors slowed their trucks, watching without getting out. The sight of survey equipment did something the paint hadn't. It made things official. Mark Ellison pulled in again, this time parking closer, stepping out with his hands in his pockets. "What's this?" he asked. "Verification," Caleb said. Mark looked from the instrument to the barn. "You think they're over the line?" Caleb didn't answer directly. "I think we're about to find out where it actually is," he said. Tom moved methodically, calling out numbers under his breath, marking points, checking alignment against the coordinates on his tablet. He didn't rush, didn't guess. Every measurement was deliberate, every adjustment intentional. After an hour, he stopped. "Come here," Tom said. Caleb walked over. Tom pointed to the ground, just a few feet from where the HOA's decorative landscaping began. "According to the subdivision plans, this is their edge." He tapped the screen. "According to the 1984 county filing, this is." He shifted his finger. The difference wasn't dramatic at first glance, just a few feet. But it was enough. Caleb studied it without speaking. Tom continued, "That's not a rounding error. That's a reference shift. Meaning? Mark asked. Tom straightened slightly. Meaning whoever laid out that subdivision said used a different baseline than the original survey. Mark frowned. So they're wrong? Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked a few steps forward, pulling a small metal detector from his case. He scanned slowly, sweeping the ground in a controlled arc. A faint tone sounded. He stopped, knelt, brushed away dirt with his hand, and then exposed it. A rusted iron marker, worn but intact, exactly where the older record said it should be. Tom looked up at Caleb. "That's your line," he said. Mark stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You're telling me everything past that isn't theirs," Tom finished. The weight of that settled fast, because it didn't just stop at the grass, it extended. Tom stood and walked further along, repeating the process. Scan, detect, clear. Another marker, same alignment, same shift. By mid-afternoon, the pattern was undeniable. The HOA boundary didn't match the land. Not here, not along the road, not anywhere Caleb could see from where he stood. Tom shut down the detector and wiped his hands on his jeans. "This isn't a small miss," he said. "This runs the length of the frontage." Caleb looked toward the entrance of the subdivision, where the HOA sign stood fixed in place, flanked by a section of decorative fence. "How far?" he asked. Tom checked the numbers again. "About 8 feet." Mark let out a low whistle. 8 feet? Tom nodded. "Across the whole stretch." Mark looked back toward the sign, then the fence, then the road itself. "That puts all of that on your side." Caleb didn't respond. He was already doing the math. Sign, fence, landscaping, possibly part of the road. Everything Diane Whitaker believed she controlled sat on land that wasn't hers to control. Tom rolled up the maps and handed one to Caleb. "I'll formalize it," he said. "Certified survey. You'll want it filed." "I will," Caleb said. Tom studied him for a moment. "You planning to act on it?" Caleb looked back toward the barn, the white paint still sharp against the afternoon light. "They already did," he said. Tom nodded once. "Then I'd move carefully," he added. "But I'd move." Mark shifted uneasily. "You're not seriously thinking about, what, taking all that back?" Caleb turned toward him. "I'm thinking about putting everything where it's supposed to be," he said. "That's going to cause a problem," Mark said. Caleb's expression didn't change. "It already has," he replied. Across the road, a black SUV slowed, then stopped. Diane Whitaker stepped out, sunglasses in place, eyes moving immediately to the equipment set up along the fence line. Her gaze lingered on Tom, on the markers, on Caleb. She didn't approach right away. She watched, measured, then finally crossed the road, stopping just short of the fence. "What's this?" she asked, her tone controlled, but tighter than before. Tom didn't answer. He wasn't working for her. Caleb stepped forward slightly. "Verification," he said again. Diane's eyes flicked to the ground, then back to him. "Verification of what?" Caleb held her gaze. "The boundary." She let out a small, dismissive breath. "That boundary was established when the subdivision was built." "That's what I'm checking," Caleb said. Diane's jaw tightened just slightly. "You've already had multiple confirmations of where that line is," she said. Caleb didn't raise his voice. "Not from me," he replied. Silence stretched between them. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough that even Mark took a step back. Diane looked once more at the markers, at the equipment, at the line that was no longer as certain as it had been that morning. Then she straightened. "This doesn't change anything," she said. Caleb didn't respond, because it already had. Diane turned and walked back to her SUV, her pace steady, her posture controlled. But as she drove away, she glanced once in the rearview mirror. Not at the barn, at the ground. And for the first time since the paint had dried, there was something new in her expression. Not confidence, not control. Something closer to doubt. Back at the fence line, Tom finished packing his equipment. "I'll have the certified report in a few days," he said. Caleb nodded. "I'll be ready," he replied. Because now the situation had shifted. It wasn't about a painted barn anymore. It wasn't even about trespass. It was about land. And land, once proven on paper, didn't ask permission to take itself back. The only question left was how far Caleb was willing to go. And by the time Diane Whitaker understood the answer, it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a correction. By the next morning, the barn was no longer the center of attention. The ground was. Tom Alvarez returned just after sunrise, this time with a different setup, more precise, more permanent. Steel pins, calibrated instruments, and a stack of printed overlays clipped to a board. He wasn't testing anymore. He was confirming. Caleb stood beside him, silent, watching each step as it unfolded. No interruptions, no questions, just observation. Tom set his first marker exactly where the original 1984 coordinates indicated. He checked it once, then again, cross-referencing against the digital grid on his tablet. Then he moved 10 yards down the line. Same process. Same result. By the third marker, the pattern wasn't just consistent. It was undeniable. Mark Ellison was back again, this time not alone. 2 other neighbors stood with him, their attention fixed on the markers being driven into the earth, like stakes in something far more permanent than dirt. "That's inside their landscaping," one of them said quietly. Tom didn't look up. "No," he replied. "Their landscaping is inside his boundary." That landed differently, because it wasn't just a shift, it was a reversal. Mark crossed his arms. "How long's this been wrong?" Tom paused, straightened slightly, and glanced toward the entrance road. "Since the day they built it." Caleb said nothing. He didn't need to. The numbers were speaking for him. By mid-morning, Tom had mapped the full stretch from the barn to the entrance sign. Every point aligned with the original filing. Every marker reinforced the same conclusion. 8 feet. Across the entire frontage. The HOA's assumed boundary didn't exist where they thought it did. It existed where it had always been recorded. And that line ran straight through everything they had built. Tom walked back toward Caleb, removing his gloves. "I've seen errors before," he said, "but not like this. This wasn't drift. This was a bad reference from the start." Caleb looked toward the road again. The HOA sign stood there, fixed in concrete, framed by decorative stone and fencing that had been installed years ago. It was meant to be permanent. Now it wasn't. "What's it affect?" Caleb asked. Tom gave a short, direct answer. "Everything between those markers and the road." Mark shook his head slowly. "That includes the sign." "And the fence, Tom added. "And the camera pole," one of the other neighbors said, pointing. Tom nodded. "All of it." Silence followed. Not confusion, understanding. Because what they were looking at wasn't just a mistake. It was ownership. And it had been wrong for years. Across town, Diane Whitaker sat at her desk, the certified letter unopened in front of her. It had arrived an hour earlier. County seal, formal envelope, no ambiguity. She hadn't touched it yet. Instead, she stared at it like opening it would somehow confirm something she wasn't ready to accept. Her phone buzzed. "Susan Keller." Diane answered immediately. "What is it?" "You need to come down here," Susan said. "They've got survey equipment out again." More people are stopping. Diane closed her eyes briefly. Let them watch. It doesn't look like they're just measuring, Susan added. They're placing markers. That got her attention. Markers for what? Diane asked. Susan hesitated. I don't know, but they're not where they used to be. Diane's gaze dropped to the letter again. Then, finally, she picked it up, tore it open, and read. The words were precise, cold, official. Boundary reassessment confirmation. Based on original recorded survey data from 1984, discrepancy identified. Correction approved. Encroachment confirmed. Her grip tightened slightly on the paper. 8 feet. The number repeated in her mind as she scanned the rest. 8 feet across the entire frontage. Structures affected. Entrance signage. Decorative fencing. Surveillance installations. The list was specific. Too specific. Diane set the paper down slowly. For the first time since the barn had been painted, the situation felt different. Not like a disagreement. Not like resistance. Like something already decided. Back at the property, Tom finished driving the final marker into the ground. He stepped back, surveying the line one last time. It's done, he said. Caleb nodded once. Next step? Mark asked. Caleb looked at the markers, then at the road, then at the structures sitting where they no longer belonged. File it, Caleb said. Then act on it. Mark frowned. Act how? Caleb didn't answer immediately, because the answer was already forming. Not in anger, not in reaction, in correction. His phone buzzed. Daniel Ross. Caleb answered. It's confirmed. I saw the preliminary, Daniel said. You're solid. County's already moved faster than I expected. Then we proceed, Caleb said. Daniel's voice lowered slightly. Once this is filed, you have full right to reclaim that land, including anything on it. Caleb looked again at the sign, the fence, the camera. Understood, he said. Daniel paused. You want to give them notice? Caleb considered that for a moment. Then he said, They didn't give me one. Daniel let out a quiet breath. All right. Then we move carefully. We move correctly, Caleb replied. Across the road, Diane Whitaker's SUV pulled up hard against the shoulder. She stepped out with the letter still in her hand, her pace faster now, controlled but no longer calm. Her eyes went straight to the markers, then to the fence, then to Caleb. You need to stop this, she said, voice tight. Caleb didn't move. Stop what? He asked. This, whatever this is, Diane snapped, holding up the letter. This isn't final. This hasn't been reviewed properly. Caleb met her gaze evenly. It has, he said. Diane shook her head. No, there's a process. It's complete, Caleb interrupted. The shift was small, but it was there. Diane looked past him, at the line of markers cutting cleanly through what she had always considered her boundary. For the first time, she didn't argue immediately, because the evidence wasn't something she could dismiss with tone or authority. It was physical, measured, filed, and now visible to everyone standing there. This doesn't change anything, she said finally, but the words didn't carry the same certainty as before. Caleb didn't respond, because now it changed everything. The only thing left was deciding how much of it he was going to take back, and Diane Whitaker was running out of time to find out. The certified survey arrived 3 days later. Tom Alvarez didn't hand it over casually. He stepped out of his truck with a sealed tube, walked it up to Caleb, and held it for a moment before letting go. like he understood exactly what was inside would change more than a boundary. "It's clean," Tom said. "Cross-checked against county filings, satellite overlay, and original markers. There's no dispute left in it." Caleb took the tube, opened it, and unrolled the document across the hood of his truck. Lines, coordinates, signatures, official stamps, everything aligned with what they had already seen on the ground. But now it was more than observation. Now it was law. Mark Ellison stood beside him, reading slowly, trying to follow the technical layout. "So this is it?" he asked. "This is final?" Caleb nodded once. "This is what the county recognizes." Mark traced a finger along the printed boundary. "That puts the road inside your line." "Part of it," Caleb said. "And the sign." "Yes." Mark looked up, disbelief settling into something heavier. "They built their whole entrance on your land." Caleb didn't correct him, because that was exactly what had happened. And it wasn't just the sign. The document listed every encroachment in detail. Decorative fencing, within corrected boundary. Landscaped median, within corrected boundary. Surveillance pole, within corrected boundary. Even the edge of the asphalt road, crossing the line in multiple sections. 8 feet didn't sound like much, until you realized it ran across everything. Tom folded his arms. "You've got full authority now," he said. "Once this is filed, you're not disputing anything, you're enforcing it." Caleb rolled the survey back up slowly. "I know." That afternoon, Daniel Ross filed the survey with the county. By evening, the notice was issued. Formal, stamped, delivered. It didn't accuse. It didn't argue. It stated, "Boundary correction accepted. Encroachments confirmed. Structures to be removed or relocated within a reasonable time frame." The language was calm, final, unavoidable. Diane Whitaker read it standing in her living room, the same space where she had once gathered her board to plan the barn painting. Now the room felt smaller. The same walls, the same furniture, but the control she had always felt inside it. Gone. Susan Keller sat across from her, the notice resting open between them. "This doesn't make sense," Susan said, her voice quieter than usual. "We've been operating like this for years." Diane didn't respond immediately. She read the document again, slower this time, as if something might change if she gave it enough attention. It didn't. "The boundary was verified when the development was approved," she said finally. Susan shook her head. "Then how is this—" "It's a mistake," Diane snapped, though the words came faster than her certainty. "A mistake that just got approved by the county?" Susan pressed. Diane stood up, pacing once across the room, then back again. "No," she said. "This is pressure. He's trying to force us into a position." Susan looked at her. "By using certified records?" Diane stopped. That was the problem. This wasn't opinion. This wasn't interpretation. It was documented, and documentation didn't bend. Her phone rang. She answered immediately. "Yes." "Diane," the HOA attorney said, voice measured but tense. "I've reviewed the filing." "And?" she asked. There was a pause, then, "We have a problem." Diane's grip tightened on the phone. "Define problem." "The boundary correction is valid," he said. "It's based on the original recorded survey, which takes precedence over the subdivision layout." "That can't be right," Diane said. "It is," he replied. "I've checked it twice." Diane's eyes moved to the window, to the road beyond, to the entrance sign that had always marked the start of her authority. "What does that mean for us?" she asked. "It means," the attorney said carefully, "that everything inside that corrected boundary belongs to him." Susan leaned forward slightly, listening now. "And the structures?" Diane asked. "They're encroachments," the attorney said. "Legally, he has the right to remove them." The room went quiet. Not tense. Still. Because the shift had already happened. Diane lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. Susan didn't speak right away. When she did, it wasn't confident. "What are we going to do?" Diane looked at the notice again, then toward the road, then back to Susan. "We're not moving anything," she said. Susan blinked. "What?" "He's bluffing," Diane said, though her voice carried less weight now. "He wants a reaction. If we start pulling down structures, we admit fault." "But the attorney is being cautious," Diane cut in. "That's what attorneys do." Susan hesitated. "And what if he doesn't wait?" Diane didn't answer, because that was the question. Across the road, Caleb stood beside the newly placed survey markers, the rolled document tucked under his arm. Mark watched him carefully. "You're really going through with this?" Caleb didn't look at him. "I already have," he said. "What does that mean?" Caleb finally turned. "It means I gave them time," he said. "Now I'm taking it back." Mark glanced toward the entrance. "You think they'll fight it?" Caleb considered that for a moment. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Why not?" Caleb looked down at the marker nearest his boots, then back up at the line stretching toward the road. "Because this isn't a fight," he said. "It's a correction." Mark let that settle, because now he understood. This wasn't escalation. This was inevitability. The survey didn't create the line. It revealed it. And once revealed, it didn't move back. Caleb turned toward his truck, opened the door, and pulled out a set of keys. Equipment keys, not for discussion, for action. Mark watched him, the realization setting in fully now. "You're not waiting for them to fix it," he said. Caleb shook his head once. "They had their chance, Osatsu," he replied, and with that, he stepped past the marker, crossing into the space that had always been his. Only now, everyone could see it. And by the next morning, so would Diane Whitaker. The sound came first. Not loud, not dramatic, just the steady grind of diesel and hydraulics cutting through the quiet that usually settled over the road at sunrise. By the time the first neighbor stepped outside, the excavator was already in position. Caleb Turner stood beside it, one hand resting on the door of the cab, the other holding a folded copy of the county-approved survey. Two men from a local contractor crew moved around him, unloading tools, setting up markers, measuring distances one last time before anything began. No announcement. No warning. Just action. Mark Ellison pulled up fast, stepping out before his truck had fully stopped. "Caleb, what are you doing?" Caleb didn't look at him right away. He was watching the line. The markers Tom had placed now ran clean and visible across the frontage, cutting through the grass and straight toward the HOA entrance, like a boundary that had been waiting years to be seen. "Correcting it," Caleb said. Mark followed his gaze, then turned toward the entrance sign, the stone base, the polished lettering, the decorative fencing framing it like something permanent. "You're going to tear that out?" Mark asked. Caleb met his eyes. "I'm going to move everything that doesn't belong where it's sitting." Mark exhaled slowly. "That's going to cause a problem." Caleb nodded once. "It already has." He turned toward the operator and gave a small signal. The machine came to life, hydraulics engaged with a low, controlled hiss. The arm lifted, extended, and positioned itself over the first section of decorative fence. White painted posts anchored just inside what the HOA had always considered their edge. Not anymore. The bucket pressed down, wood cracked, clean, deliberate. The first section lifted free from the ground and swung slowly to the side, where one of the crew members guided it down onto Caleb's side of the newly established boundary. No rush, no destruction, just removal. Across the road, more cars began to gather. Doors opened. People stepped out, drawn not by noise but by what the noise meant. They had seen the painted barn. They had seen the markers. But this was different. This was irreversible. Mark stepped back as the second section of fence came up, his eyes moving between Caleb and the growing crowd. "They're going to show up," he said. Caleb didn't respond, because he already knew. The excavator shifted again, this time toward the base of the HOA sign. The concrete footing sat squarely within the corrected boundary line, its edges clean, its placement deliberate. The operator hesitated for a fraction of a second. Caleb stepped forward and handed him a copy of the survey. The operator glanced at it, then back at the ground, then nodded once. Authorization. That was all he needed. The bucket lowered, pressed, cracked the edge of the base, and began to lift. That was when the black SUV appeared, fast, too fast for the road. It pulled up hard against the shoulder, tires kicking dust as it stopped. Diane Whitaker stepped out before the engine fully cut, the door slamming behind her as she moved toward the site. "Stop!" she shouted. The word cut through the noise, sharp enough to turn heads. The excavator paused, not because of the command, because Caleb raised his hand. He turned slowly to face her as she approached, her steps quick, controlled, but no longer measured the way they had been before. "What do you think you're doing?" Diane demanded. Caleb held the folded survey in his hand, then extended it toward her, enforcing it. She didn't take the paper. "I told you this isn't settled," she said. "There's a process." "It's completed," Caleb replied. Diane shook her head. "No. You don't get to just come in here and start tearing down community property." Caleb's voice stayed even. "It's not community property." That stopped her for half a second. Then she pushed forward again. "That sign has been there for years. That fence is on my land," Caleb said. The crowd had gone quiet now. Every word carried. Every shift mattered. Diane looked past him at the excavator, at the section of fence already removed, at the cracked edge of the sign's base. "You can't do this without notice," she said. Caleb's eyes met hers. "You didn't give me one." The words landed harder than anything else had so far. Because they weren't loud. They were exact. Diane opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately. Behind her, Susan Keller arrived, slower this time, her gaze moving quickly across the scene. The markers, the removed fencing, the crowd, the operator waiting for direction. "This is getting out of control," Susan said quietly. Diane didn't look at her. "This is illegal," Diane said instead, louder now. "You're going to regret this." Caleb didn't move. "Everything I'm doing is documented," he said. "Filed, approved, enforced." He gestured slightly toward the survey in his hand. "You're welcome to review it." Diane stared at the paper, then at him. And for the first time since the barn had been painted, she didn't have an immediate answer, because the situation had moved beyond argument, beyond interpretation, into action. The excavator idled behind Caleb, waiting. He glanced back once, then gave the signal. The machine moved again. The bucket settled against the base of the sign, applying steady pressure. Concrete shifted, cracked, lifted. Slowly, the structure that had marked the HOA's authority for years began to rise out of the ground. The crowd stepped back instinctively, the weight of the moment settling over them. Because this wasn't just removal, it was exposure. Everything they had assumed belonged to the HOA didn't. Diane stood frozen, watching as the sign lifted free and was carried across the line, placed carefully inside Caleb's boundary. No damage beyond what was necessary. No anger in the movement. just correction. The fence sections followed. The camera pole came next. Each piece removed, relocated, and set down with the same deliberate care. Mark watched it all, shaking his head slowly. "I've never seen anything like this." Caleb didn't answer, because neither had he. Not like this. Not this clean. Not this final. When the work paused, the line was visible in a way it had never been before. Markers, open ground, and everything that had crossed it now moved. Diane finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, but edged with something sharper than anger. "This isn't over." Caleb looked at her, calm as ever. "No," he said, "it isn't." Because what had been moved this morning wasn't just wood and concrete. It was control. And once that shifted, there was no putting it back where it used to be. By noon, the entire entrance had changed. Where the HOA sign once stood, there was now open ground marked by survey stakes. The decorative fence sat stacked neatly along Caleb's side of the line. The camera pole, once positioned to monitor community property, leaned quietly beside it, disconnected and useless. Nothing had been destroyed, but everything had been moved. And that was worse. Diane Whitaker stood in the middle of it, silent now. The crowd around her no longer looking to her for answers. They were looking at the ground, at the line, at what it meant. Her phone buzzed again. This time she didn't ignore it. She stepped away from the crowd and answered, her voice lower, tighter. "Yes." "Diane," the HOA attorney said, and there was no attempt to soften his tone this time. "You need to stop him immediately." Her jaw tightened. "I've already told him." "No," he cut in, "not verbally. Legally, you need to cease any further confrontation and do not interfere with his actions." Diane's eyes flicked back to Caleb, who stood beside the excavator, reviewing something with one of the crew members. "He's removing association property," she said. "He's removing encroachments," the attorney corrected. "There's a difference, and right now the law is on his side." Diane didn't respond. "Did you receive the second notice?" he asked. Her grip tightened slightly. "What second notice?" There was a pause. Then, "Check your email." Diane ended the call immediately and pulled up her phone. The message was already there, time-stamped less than 20 minutes ago. Subject: Formal notice of liability and evidence submission. Her stomach dropped slightly before she even opened it. The document attached wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. It included still images pulled directly from the security footage. Time-stamped, clear, undeniable. Diane stepping over the fence, Susan holding the sprayer, the worker adjusting equipment, the brush in Diane's hand, the words forming on the barn wall, each frame labeled, each action described. Below the images, the language was precise. Unauthorized entry, property defacement, coordinated action, documented evidence, potential charges outlined under state statute. Diane's thumb hovered over the screen as she scrolled further, and then she saw it. A statement from Daniel Ross. Evidence has been submitted to county authorities for review. Additional claims may include civil liability for damages, legal costs, and injunctive relief. Further escalation will proceed if interference continues. Diane lowered the phone slowly. For the first time, this wasn't just about control. It was about consequence. Susan approached carefully. "What is it?" Diane didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the phone slightly so Susan could see. Susan read the images first, then the text. Her face changed. "That's from the camera?" she asked. "Yes." "You said there wasn't." "I didn't know," Diane snapped, then caught herself. The damage was done. The evidence wasn't just real, it was organized, prepared, and now it was out of her control. Across the site, Caleb closed the folder in his hands and looked toward the road. He could see the shift happening. Not just in Diane, in everyone. The crowd wasn't murmuring anymore. They were quiet. Watching. Processing. Because what they were witnessing wasn't a dispute. It was a correction backed by proof. Mark stepped closer to Caleb, lowering his voice. That looked different. Caleb nodded once. It is. That email? Mark asked. Documentation, Caleb said. Mark glanced toward Diane, then back. She's not laughing anymore. Caleb didn't respond, because that had never been the goal. Diane walked back toward him, slower this time, her steps no longer sharp with certainty. When she stopped in front of him, she didn't raise her voice. What do you want? She asked. It wasn't a demand. It was a question. And that alone changed everything. Caleb met her eyes, calm as ever. What I've already taken, he said. And what's left to correct? Diane shook her head slightly. You're exposing the entire association over a boundary error. Caleb didn't blink. I didn't create the error. But you're escalating it. No, Caleb said quietly. You did that when you stepped onto my land. The words hung there, simple and direct. Diane looked past him again, at the stacked fence, the removed sign, the markers cutting through what used to be hers to manage, then back at him. And the footage? She asked. It speaks for itself. Her voice dropped further. You're going to file charges. Caleb considered that for a moment. I'm going to follow the law, he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. And that made it harder to fight. Diane looked down at the ground between them, at the line, at the space she had crossed without thinking 2 nights ago. Now it was all she could see. Behind her, more residents had gathered, not to support her, to understand what had happened and what it meant. Because if the boundary had been wrong, what else had been? Susan stepped forward slightly. We can fix this, she said, almost pleading. We can move the structures, work something out. Caleb looked at her. You already had that option, he said. Silence again. Because everyone knew when that option had passed. The moment the paint touched the barn, the moment the brush formed those words, the moment they crossed the line. Diane straightened slowly, something in her expression settling. Not back into control, but into realization. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. Not with authority, not with tone, not with presence. Because this wasn't about perception anymore. It was about proof. And proof didn't negotiate. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from the board. Emergency meeting requested. Immediate. Diane didn't open it. She already knew what it would say. The shift had reached them, too. She looked at Caleb one last time. This isn't over, she said. But the words carried something different now. Not confidence, not defiance. Uncertainty. Caleb nodded once. No, he said. It's not. Because what came next wasn't about moving fences or removing signs. It was about everything that had been built on a line that never existed. And now, that truth was out, and it wasn't going back in. The meeting room was full before it officially started. Folding chairs lined the walls. Residents stood in the back. Conversations overlapped in low, uneasy tones, the kind that came when people realized something they had trusted might not have been real to begin with. Diane Whitaker stood near the front, papers in hand, but she wasn't speaking yet. She was waiting. Not for the room to settle, for control to return. It didn't. At the back of the room, Caleb Turner stepped inside without announcement. He didn't move to the front, didn't push past anyone. He took a seat along the side wall, a single folder resting on his lap. Mark Ellison noticed him first. Then others did. And slowly, the attention in the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Diane saw it, and understood immediately that whatever she said next wouldn't land the way it used to. She stepped forward anyway. "The situation at the entrance this morning," she began, her voice steady but tighter than usual, "has been misrepresented." Murmurs moved through the room. "Misrepresented?" someone echoed. Diane continued, pushing through it. "The boundary dispute is still under review, and no final determination has been made. That's not true." The interruption wasn't loud, but it cut clean. Daniel Ross stepped forward from near the entrance, a document already in his hand. "The county has already approved the correction," he said. "The filing is public record." Diane turned toward him, jaw tightening. "And you are counsel for Mr. Turner," Daniel replied. The room shifted again, because now it wasn't just neighbors talking. It was law. Daniel stepped further into the center, holding up the document just enough for those closest to see the seal. "This," he said, "confirms the boundary established in 1984. Every structure removed this morning was located within Mr. Turner's property line." A man near the front raised his hand slightly. "So the sign was never legally placed where it stood," Daniel said. "And the fence?" another asked. "Same. And the road?" Daniel paused, just long enough to make the answer land. "Partially encroaching," he said. The room went quiet. Not confused, not argumentative. Quiet. Because the scale of it was starting to settle in. Diane stepped forward again, trying to regain ground. "Even if that's the case, the association acted in good faith based on—" "Good faith doesn't override recorded property lines," Daniel said evenly. Diane's voice sharpened. "And what about his actions? Removing community property without correcting encroachments on his own land," Daniel replied. "With documentation, with approval, with legal authority." Each word narrowed the space Diane had left to stand on. She looked around the room, but the support she expected wasn't there. People weren't nodding. They weren't backing her up. They were watching, listening, reconsidering. Caleb remained seated, still, silent, but present. Daniel continued. "There is also another matter that needs to be addressed." He set the boundary document down and opened a second file. Inside were printed stills, from the footage, time-stamped, clear, unavoidable. "These images," Daniel said, "were captured on Mr. Turner's property 2 nights ago." He placed the first one on the table at the front. Diane stepping over the fence. The second. Susan holding the sprayer. The third. The paint. The brush. The words forming. A low ripple moved through the room. Not shock, recognition. Because now the story had proof. "This constitutes trespass," Daniel said, "as well as property damage. Evidence has already been submitted to the county." Diane didn't move, didn't speak. Because this wasn't something she could respond to the way she had before. This wasn't interpretation. This was record. A woman near the front stood up slowly. "You went onto his land?" she asked, looking directly at Diane. Diane hesitated, just for a second, and that was enough. "I was enforcing standards," she said finally. The room reacted this time, not loudly, but decisively. "That's not enforcement," someone said. "That's crossing a line," another added. The words carried weight now, because the line wasn't theoretical anymore. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew where it was, and more importantly, where it wasn't. Daniel stepped back slightly, letting the room take over, because this part didn't need legal explanation. It needed recognition. Caleb finally stood. Not quickly. Not dramatically. He walked forward, the folder still in his hand, and placed it on the table beside the documents already laid out. Inside were copies of everything: the survey, the filing, the photographs, the timeline. All of it organized, all of it quiet. He looked at the room, not at Diane. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I came here to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be." He let that sit, then added, "That's it. No accusations, no threats, no demands, just a statement." And somehow, that made it land harder than anything else that had been said. An older man near the front leaned forward. "So what happens now?" Caleb glanced briefly at Daniel, then back at the room. "What's already started," he said, "finishes." Diane's hands tightened slightly at her sides. "Meaning?" she asked. Caleb met her eyes. "The structures get moved," he said. "The boundary gets respected, and anything that crossed it gets addressed." Diane held his gaze, but this time, there was nothing behind hers to push back with. No certainty, no authority, just consequence. The board called for a vote not long after. It wasn't framed as punishment, it was framed as correction. Leadership review, financial audit, policy realignment. The language stayed formal, but the meaning was clear. Hands went up, one after another, not hesitant, not divided, decisive. By the time it ended, Diane Whitaker was no longer president. The vote didn't erase what had happened, but it acknowledged it, and that mattered more. Outside, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows across the road. The entrance where the sign had stood was open now, unmarked except for the survey stakes and the fresh line that cut clean across the ground. Caleb stood near the fence, looking at it. Not the absence of the sign, not the space where it used to be. The line itself, because that was what remained. That was what had always been there, unchanged, unmoved, just unrecognized. Until now. Mark stepped up beside him. "You really didn't need to say much in there." Caleb nodded slightly. "Didn't need to," he said. Mark looked out at the road. "Think they'll remember it?" Caleb considered that, then said, "They'll remember where the line is." He turned back toward the barn. The white paint was already being sanded down, the red beneath it starting to show through again in uneven patches. Correction, piece by piece, just like everything else. As Caleb walked back toward the house, the quiet settled in again, not the same as before, but steady in a different way. Resolved. Because the line had been drawn, not by paint, not by assumption, but by truth. And once truth was put in the ground, it didn't move. It didn't bend. It didn't disappear. It stayed exactly where it belonged, waiting for someone to respect it. And now, they finally did.
What this story really shows is simple, but it's something a lot of people forget. Truth doesn't need to be loud to hurt its broad. Caleb didn't win because he argued harder or pushed back louder. He stood still, gathered his thought, and let the Lord speak where emotion couldn't. And in the end, it wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about putting things back where they were always meant to be. There's a quiet kind of strength in that. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't react, doesn't need an audience, just patience, clarity, and knowing exactly where you stand, literally and otherwise. If you ever deal with an HOA, a property like issues, or someone trying to push past what's yours, drop a once in the comments. And if you believe in saying your ground the right way, type yes, so others know they are not alone in it. And if stories like this speak to you, the kind where people don't shout, they stand, go ahead and surprise. There's plenty more real story ahead about land, law, and the kind of quiet courage that still matters.